So I have the unenviable task of following that very, how should I put it, very compendious analysis, and I mean that with great admiration.
Well, you get the details.
Great admiration.
You get the details.
So I'm going to make a couple of points, and perhaps I'll touch on some of the same material that George did, and it'll be a test, I guess, for you to see if there's any difference between the two of us, what we're saying. I was going to begin by asking the question of why it is that right now the media are going all out in this Russiagate campaign to impeach Trump for a presumed Russia-friendly policy. Neoliberal globalists have been hooting about Russia for years. It didn't just start with Trump. And the question occurs then, why is this? Why have they been hooting about this? Why has Russia been causing so much agony in Washington and in Manhattan? Why is Russia causing so much agony? And why should there be a Cold War against Russia? Is it a natural thing for us to go immediately from a Cold War with Soviet Russia over to a Cold War with post-Soviet Russia? And what does that tell us about what the Cold War was? Was it really just a contest between the two countries? And was communism entirely irrelevant? I don't know. So all these questions occur to us, and I have a couple of thoughts about how to answer some of these questions. But they begin, of course, with the absolute oddity of the continued hostility toward Russia that we've seen in the last decade or so. As if it weren't enough, that the Cold War was lost by Soviet Russia. I don't want to say it actually was won by the United States, more lost by Soviet Russia, lost by the reforms that caused Russia to fall in upon itself psychologically, morally, and almost every other way. Wasn't that enough that the West won the Cold War, that the U.S. won the Cold War? Wasn't it enough that the Soviets gave up their Warsaw Pact allies? Wasn't it enough that they allowed Germany to unite with all the portents around German unification that have been well known by virtually anybody who studies 20th century history? Wasn't it enough that they partitioned the Soviet Union? My God, they took apart not just Soviet Russia, but they took apart Peter the Great's Russia as well. So that's enormous. And wasn't it enough that, that sounds like that Jewish song that you sing at Passover. Wasn't it enough that they restored capitalism in Russia? And we still have to hate them, still have to have this campaign against them. There's still a Russian threat. Why is this? So I have a couple of small points with which to pursue an answer to that. And let me say what they are briefly. First, there's a psychological problem in the ruling orders of the United States, a deep psychological problem in the mind of neoliberal globalists who can't tolerate the idea of a national revival in Russia. The globalists have been gathering in the spoils of the Cold War, and they've got used to the balance of power that existed in the 1990s. According to that balance of power, anything you say to the Russians, they have to do it. They're going to cave in constantly. And I think about Russia prior to World War I. She went through 3 crises over the Balkans, and the Germans pressed them 3 times, Bosnia and both Balkan wars. And the Russians backed down every time. The Germans became convinced the Russians will always back down. But then in 1914, they didn't back down. So maybe we're getting into that same syndrome. Then the second point. Neoliberal globalists are waging a desperate, gloomy struggle against what they perceive as a world revolt against them in the name of a new statist, nationalist, neo-mercantilist model that they like to call state capitalism. It's just a variety of statist economic forms around the world. You can say it's a kind of indirect, how should I put it, refraction of socialism, in a way, of 19th century socialism. But at any rate, it's the state. And those who consider that the difference between socialism and capitalism revolves around the whole question of the role of the state might think perhaps this is a socialist phenomenon that we see. At any rate, neoliberal globalists regard it with the same degree of horror that they did the socialism of previous times. And then the third point. Neoliberal globalists see the Trump presidency as the American theater of this global struggle against their idea. So Trump, he represents a worldwide phenomenon. He's the American version of this worldwide revolt against neoliberalism. And Hillary Clinton has put it exactly that way. She says he is the great inspirer of all these wicked nationalisms throughout the world. And that's why we have to be opposed to him. This is producing a constitutional crisis in the United States, and it's fueling a situation that can lead to war. And I think I agree entirely with what George was saying about that, and would underline that with George. And then the fourth point, there are some wholesome, and which George got to at the very end of his talk. There are some wholesome countervailing tendencies for peace and popular action in the world, but just barely. But they do exist, and they can make common cause in various indirect ways with other tendencies in the world, and perhaps we can see something hopeful looming up in the future. So let me expand briefly in the brief time I have left. Let me expand briefly on those four points. First, the Soviet Union collapsed at the height of its world influence. It was not going under economically. There's no way you can argue that if you look seriously at their economic performance prior to the fall of communism. They were not going under it for that reason, and nor were they bullied into submission by American policy. So these are two big myths that the neo-globalists are marching forward with, and they underlie all their thoughts, and they're entirely misbegotten, entirely erroneous, and so this is why their ideas are so screwy, in my opinion. They are under the impression that communism doesn't work, socialism, statist systems don't work. They'll fall apart naturally. The populations hate them for the economic reasons, not because of dictatorship, but for the fact that they're not capitalists. This is all wet, and they have this view, and this has become ingrained in their worldview. It's like something they read in the Bible. And it's as a result of the experience of the Gorbachev years. And then, secondly, the idea that Russia always has to cave in, always has to be in a state of decline and, how to put it, transition into a federalist system, maybe the sale of Siberia, or one or another of those notions that were brooded in the 1990s. These ideas are part and parcel of the neoliberal outlook today, the elite outlook in Washington and Manhattan. So they are marching forward with these very, very misbegotten historical lessons. And it's not exactly their fault, really. It's the fault of Gorbachev and Yeltsin for having destroyed the Soviet Union the way they did. Nobody has ever done anything like that in history. No state has ever gone, no great state has ever gone under like that without a war in history. So that's the problem that they have. So at the end of the thing in the 1990s, the mood was that the important thing on the agenda was to gather in the spoils of the Cold War. NATO expansionism, shock therapy in the former Soviet Union. I think it was a question of Russia delenda est. You know, as the Romans said about Carthage, they said Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be completely destroyed. And I think that Russia must be completely destroyed in order for us to be happy. At any rate, deprived of her nuclear weapons, maybe reduced to the province of ancient Muscovy, maybe separated from Siberia, her presumed component parts. Maybe that would be enough. But even with that, there would be a tax on whoever ruled that Muscovite state. There would be a tax on that person, the same way Milosevic was attacked. So the mood will be the same. Often people talk about national interest. They think they are talking about something very calm and manageable and sane, etc., because they're talking about national interest in terms of need. This is national interest also in terms of desire. And you know how it is about desire. You desire one thing and you get it. Next thing you know, you desire something else. You've got to have something else. So this goes on with nations, I think, as well. So the United States just got into the habit, fell into the habit, you have to say, of thinking that they weren't up against anything when they were dealing with Russia. Russia even wanted to enter NATO in the 1990s. Even Putin made it as the first desideratum of his foreign policy to make Russia eligible to enter NATO, but no, out of the question. The United States is not going to do that. Instead, NATO expansion, right up to the borders of Russia. And a revival, as George tells us, of the old geopolitical notions of the naval encirclement of Eurasia. So the United States is the biggest naval power. We've got these 11 carrier groups. Nobody else has got anything remotely like that. We're a world hegemon that nobody has ever seen in history. And all they represent are some Asian powers. We should be able to squeeze them. It's the verdict of history. And that's the thought that is driving things forward. And that was a thought that was thought to be irresistible until the end of the 20th century, last year or so of the end of the 20th century. And then two events changed everything in capitalist Russia. First, the fall of the ruble in 1991. Capitalism went under. The whole experiment absolutely went under. As if it hadn't caused enough suffering by that time, it gave them an inflation comparable to the German inflation of 1922. It gave them a depression. Half of the industrial product disappeared. Industrial production cut in half. That's comparable to the Great Depression. So combination of the Great Depression and the greatest inflation in the world, and the Russian people had to suffer under that whole thing. So that was their moment. But all of that completely collapsed with the fall of the ruble in 1998. And then the second thing, this ongoing destruction of Yugoslavia finally struck Yeltsin as a bit too much. Yeltsin had been compliant, going along with everything up to that point, but the last stage of it, which involved 80 days worth of bombing of Belgrade by Bill Clinton trying to divert attention from his affair with Monica Lewinsky, that this was finally too much, this Kosovo affair. So those two things, Yeltsin started to turn against neoliberalism even before Putin did. And then when Putin came into power, Putin continued in the same vein. Putinism rebuilt Russia as a petrostate. Well, it wasn't a real petrostate, strictly speaking, under the Soviet Union, but petrostates, they can be wealthy, they can be powerful, and Putin was the one who put those two ideas together. He once wrote a master's thesis on oil policy, so he knew all about Russian oil and natural resources and the riches that Russia had. So he rebuilt them as a petrostate. In 2008, they passed legislation making 42 national so-called sectors of the economy, oil and gas, arms, national security, some telecommunications, anything that had to do with national power, taboo for foreign investment. So, well, not strictly taboo, only minority, foreigners could only have a minority interest in anything in those sectors. So in effect, they nationalized. I have to use that word between inverted commas, not exactly nationalized. A lot of it's under private ownership. But the private owners, they're national champions. That is to say, they, and a lot of states around the world do this. They take big firms and favor them, make sure that they get hold of very important resources and are a real backing for national power. And that's pretty much the way it went in Russia. The oligarchs are driven out of the media, Of course, in the United States, we're going to denounce that because that's a blow against free speech, etc. But on the other hand, Russian people didn't feel that way, and they didn't mind, I don't think, seeing Gusinsky and Berezovsky reduced in their control over media. They didn't turn into media barons. And in effect, what Putin enforced over these oligarchs was what I would call an imperial German model, according to the economist Werner Sombart, who said in the 1880s that the imperial German state was run by the nobility, that the bourgeoisie ran the economy. The bourgeoisie ran the economy, were almighty in that sphere, but they could not stick their nose into politics in even the slightest way. So stay out of politics. And that was the great wisdom, Sombart said, about the imperial German system. Some people might say that's pretty much the scheme in Xi Jinping's China today, that they get a pretty free hand with private industry. The bourgeoisie is allowed to do just about anything it wants, but cannot get involved in politics. So that's the model that Putin put into effect, and he was immediately powerful, very, very popular. His polls went way up in the first year that he was in power, and this has been consistently something that has built up his popularity with the Russian people. And he turned to a Eurasian model, I would call it, of polycentrism against the United States. Here I've used this term polycentrism, which used to be used to describe all the different communists fighting with one another in the 60s and 70s. Some of them in my classrooms. I've got to admit, George and I were talking about this before we came on tonight.
Didn't Steve and you get a fight?
And Steve was one of them. No, I don't blame Steve there. But anyhow, this polycentrism idea, now this idea can be applied to nation states, and that, as George was saying, that is Russia's ideal. A large number of states that are powerful states that can even be world powers, this is a weird notion, can even be world powers and that are opposed to hegemony. As a matter of fact, the Chinese and the Russians, they give a lot of speeches in which they call each other, they say we're both world powers, but we're against hegemony. So there is such a thing as hegemony. How could they be world powers if there's a hegemon? So it's a bit of a contradiction in this. This is the Kaiser's idea of a world power, a big naval power that could get involved in anything, quarrel with the British Empire anywhere on the globe. That was the Kaiser's idea prior to World War I. Does China or Russia have this sort of status today? Absolutely not. Out of the question. So this is a wild pretension of theirs, which is going to get punctured at some point. They think they can interfere in any question that goes on all over the globe against the American Navy, against all the American nuclear weapons, and all the rest of that. There's a forlorn struggle going on in the United States against what it sees as this encroaching new state model in the world, as if it were socialism. It fears it as if it were socialism. Neo-mercantilism rather than free trade. State firms that have a prominent place in the economy. National champions. Sovereign wealth funds. Huge funds from states that have a favorable balance of payments and can even bail out American banks. During 2008, during the crisis, these sovereign wealth funds can lend money to these banks and bail them out. There are banks. This is our capitalism. But other people are bailing them out. It's quite extraordinary. This new Silk Road that George made reference to, this Chinese project to unite the Far East with Europe, this is an extraordinary idea, and Mackinder never dreamed when he talked about the heartland at the beginning of the 20th century that there'd ever be anything quite so formidable as that, linked not only by railroads, but by every other kind of transportation, and then more than that, extension through the oceans. That's where it's going to run into problems, because extending itself through the oceans is going to run up against the American Navy. So this is going to cause great difficulties in the future, and this is a possible entry into a new condition of war. And then an ideology that goes along with this big threat to neoliberalism, which is, I think, worthy of note and usually doesn't get the attention it deserves. The Russians are pursuing what I would call Byzantine Caesaropapism. The Byzantine conception of the role of the church and state. You know, the Western idea of the church and state is that they're separate and even opposed at times. The Byzantine idea and the Russian idea is that the Orthodox Church backs up the state 100% and in fact endows it with a holy character. It endows its power with a holy character. So that has been revived, and Putin takes that very seriously. Then the other great threat, Chinese Marxism. Well, some neoliberals are of the opinion that China is capitalist. But then, of course, we can have a long, dull debate about that, whether China is capitalist or socialist. But the Chinese definitely say they are socialist. In fact, they say that they're Marxists. In fact, they donate a statue of Karl Marx to the birthplace of Marx in Germany, in Trier, and it's made by a Chinese sculptor. So the Chinese, I would take them at their word and say, and I'm sure there are people here who will denounce me for this heresy, but I think you have to say they're Marxists. They think they're Marxists at any rate. That's worth something. And there are other threats to the neoliberals. Various social democratic models in Latin America who've been very, very influential. The pink tide in Latin America, Venezuela leading it until recently, and of course with all its great difficulties, and the battle against austerity in Europe. Add all those things up and you have a multifaceted, disunited, but very formidable looking array of enemies of neoliberalism. Strictly speaking, the neoliberal consensus. So what's the USA's best weapon against all this? Well, the oil price. The oil price transformed, transmogrified, sent capitalism through a metamorphosis in the 1970s with the oil shocks. The whole economy was turned around, and perhaps we can talk more about the economics of that in the question period. And it works that way today in reverse. Rather than raising the oil price and redirecting all the money flows in the world the way it was done in the 70s, it's the opposite. We lower the oil price. Saudi Arabia turns on the spigots, and we get a tremendous low up, which hurts the petrostates. And the petrostates are the ones who are against neoliberalism, Venezuela, Russia, etc. They're very deeply hurt. You can see in Venezuela.
Brazil.
They're the whole array. And all of this because of the arrangement with Saudi Arabia. So that is a very powerful weapon in the hands of neoliberalism.
Back off the microphone a little bit.
Pardon?
You're muddying because you're too close to it.
Okay. At the end of this, I'm going to give a rendition of Some Enchanted Evening.
It will not sound good if you're that close to the microphone.
Okay. There are other weapons that the neoliberals have to use. Some of the national alignments are quite unique, and we are not getting the attention they deserve, in my opinion. Poland, for example, is revived, leading NATO, and speaking against Russia, and no mystery there, and similarly Sweden, the perennial neutral, a country that managed to stay out of World War II and sell steel to Nazi Germany. So now Sweden is a very eager supporter of NATO and wants to help beef up the military defenses, so to speak, of the Baltic states against the Russian threat. And what goes with that, of course, the threats that they pose to Kaliningrad Oblast, which is engulfed, I should have some PowerPoint here, but engulfed around between Lithuania and Poland. So the Russians have a very exposed sore toe there. And of course, the Swedes want to definitely step on it. Swedes, of all people. So there is a new alignment that can help the neoliberal forces. And excuse me. And then in the Middle East, a brutal clarification of policy in the Middle East, such as what's on display last couple of weeks with Trump's trip there, where the United States is going to throw in its lot unreservedly behind the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia at their head, and Israel, of course, against Iran. So there's another place where we could have a huge blow, but these are all cards to play by policymakers in Washington. In fact, Trump's thought, I think, now here I'm going to actually say that there is a Trump thought, but I can't be entirely sure of it. But the way I figure it, Trump is thinking that there's a linkage between the Russian question in Eastern Europe and the Russian question in the Middle East, and that he's probably going to play ball. Who knows if this is right, but he's probably going to play ball with the Russians in East Europe in order to get them to put up with attacks on Iran in the Middle East. In other words, to drive a wedge between Russia and Iran, comparable to what George was saying about driving a wedge between Russia and China. That has to be one of the desiderata of American foreign policy. And then my third point, just to remind you, I'm on the second point, and now I'm going to the third point. I actually should have handed out an outline. That would have made everything a lot easier, especially for me. But the third point, no neoliberal, I don't think there's any neoliberal who thought Trump was ever going to become president. So they're totally shocked by this. We have to be sympathetic and understand what they're going through, trying to get used to the idea of Trump as president. In his first week, after all, he got rid of the TPP and the TTIP. They have got a huge investment in free trade, and especially in using these two agreements as weapons against Russia on the one side and in the Atlantic, and against China on the other side in the Pacific. So they lost both of those in the first week that Trump was in power. That would be enough to explain the enormous hostility to Trump that you see in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, various places, all the CNN, New York Times, go after, Washington Post especially, go after him every day. So Trump represents a lot for them to swallow. And moreover, they are beset by a neo-fascist right-wing populism right in the Trump government, but also in Europe, which they fear greatly. Thank goodness they fear this. I think this is a healthy thing, that they don't fall right in with it. And then they also fear a anti-austerity social democracy, such as represented by Corbyn in England and by others, as Bernie Sanders here. In the end, they may feel themselves caught between, Steve Bannon on one side and Bernie Sanders on the other. And I think the natural feeling among them should be to dislike them both with the same kind of intensity. In the end, Trump is going to come up against impeachment. It looks like this campaign is not going to ease up, and it looks like they want to get him. It's going to.
I call it regime change.
Regime change, yes, it is regime change, all right.
They won't get him out.
Okay. Do I come to your house and bother you with it?
Tony, we maybe should shift to Steve, and then we'll have a Q&A.
I'm just going to finish up.
Okay.
Just going to finish up. All right. Everyone thinks I'm talking too long, and you probably have a point. Let me just get to the end here. Neoliberalism is beset, in other words, on two fronts, and they're unhappy with both of them. there might be some kind of peaceful, how to put it, some class collaborationist, I guess that would have to be the word, a way around all this, that this may not have to come to an all-out war. I hope we reach that point. In the 30s, globalism broke down, fascism rose up. The United States, in the end, made the right choice, I think, between fascism and the World Popular Front. It made the right choice by opposing fascism. Today, globalism is breaking down. Neo-fascism is much weaker, and it gets little elite attention or approval. And on the other side, the social democratic alternative has yet to arise. So neoliberalism still has prospects of crushing both of them. Should it fail to do so, though, elites may decide that social democracy is not so bad. But I think only if they fear the fascist threat on the other side. I think one can put it down as a general rule that neoliberalism will only make the right choice after it has exhausted all the other alternatives. We're all positivists. Well, I'm not so sure that everybody's a positivist here, but I'm rather a positivist, very naive when it comes to things like this. I don't want to see another nuclear war. I don't want to see the crisis of capitalism have to come to another nuclear war. So I'm looking for some way around that thing. But I think in the end, this may be a very naive point of view, because I think history loves extremes.